Hi guys, welcome to Theology Explained. I'm Jem, and today we're talking about who wrote the Bible. The two main writers of the New Testament are Paul and John. Paul was a Pharisee and he persecuted a lot of the early Christians, and he would search and find them to imprison them and even put them to death. And there's a story in Acts when a disciple called Stephen is stoned to death, and Paul watches over the cloaks of the men who stone him. And then shortly after this stoning, Paul is on his way to Damascus, a city in Judea, first century Judea, and he has a vision from God and he becomes a Christian. And from that point on, he then completely changes his purpose to support the church. At the start, the disciples don't really trust him, but then slowly they build their relationship together, and Paul becomes one of the apostles of Jesus. And through this really close relationship of Paul and the disciples who were literally one-to-one relationship with Jesus, Paul really knew who Jesus was, and he really got a great understanding, and his knowledge of the Old Testament was even greater. And so he combines these two great wealths of knowledge, and he becomes a great encourager and builder of the early church. And he writes lots of letters to the churches that are being set up by Paul and by the other disciples. And through these churches and through these letters, we have a lot of the writing in the New Testament. The other really major New Testament writer was John, who was actually one of the disciples of Jesus. It's traditionally attributed that he wrote a gospel, 3 letters, and the book of Revelation. And then you have the cynic, and they say, well, okay, but Paul's just a theologian, and John, well, he could just be lying to us. And so I say, let's just stop right there. Let's just look at the Gospels. Let's just look at the 4 accounts of Jesus' ministry and life. The only 4 that we know of, the only 4 that we can really trust. And let's look at the authorship. Let's look at who's writing what. Compare them. Maybe they're all just trying to trick us. We've got 4. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But there's actually a divide in the 4. There's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. So the Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. And they're called the Synoptic Gospels because of how similar they all are. I'm sure if you've read it for yourself, it seems like you have deja vu. After you read Matthew, you go into Mark and it's the same stories, and then you go into Luke and it's the same stories again. This is when it gets interesting. We've got 94% of Mark in Matthew. We've got 79% of Mark in Luke. We've got Matthew and Luke sharing 24%, roughly. Then we've got 20% of Matthew, which is just unique to Matthew, and 35% of Luke, which is just unique to Luke. So we begin to ask the quite serious question, well, did they just copy each other? Are we just having the wool pulled over our eyes? Is this all a trick? Who copied who? Did Mark write first, and then Matthew used Mark, and Luke used Matthew and Mark? Did Luke write first, and then Mark reduced Luke, and then Matthew used Mark and Luke? Did Matthew and Luke write first, and then Mark used both Matthew and Luke and reduced both of them? Where does the 24% come from that's in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark? And this problem is called the synoptic problem. Who wrote first? I'm going to give you 4 hypotheses, and you can go away and research it yourself, but these are sort of the most famous and the most well-respected. The first hypothesis is that it's parallel thinking. They all wrote their accounts, and no one copied anyone, it's just by chance. That is the least respected theory. The second is the Augustinian Butler hypothesis that says that Matthew wrote first, Mark reduced Matthew, and Luke reduced Matthew and also used Mark. The third is the Griesbach-Farmer hypothesis that says that Matthew wrote first, Luke used Matthew, and then Mark reduced both Matthew and Luke into his gospel. The fourth is the Farrell-Goulder hypothesis that says that Mark wrote first, then Matthew used Mark, and then Luke used both Mark and Matthew. The big issue with these ones is that no one's accounting for the 24%-ish that's shared between Matthew and Luke, and that's not in Mark. Where did that come from? Then we get something called Q, which is short for quella, which means source. This is the lost source that informed both Matthew and Luke, but not Mark. Somehow the 2 writers came across this source. We don't know where it is, we don't know what it is, we don't know if it's oral tradition, We don't know if it's a written tradition, but it's lost. And then we get the 4-source hypothesis. So let's say Mark wrote first, Matthew used Mark, Luke definitely used Mark, and then you've got M, who informed Matthew, L, who informed Luke, Q, who informed Matthew and Luke but not Mark. It's somewhere in that capacity that is how the Synoptic Gospels were written. But ultimately, the Markan priority, which just means that Mark wrote first, is the most trustworthy. Mark, his themes are quite simple. It's clearly rushed. If you read it, it's very much just this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and he just wants to get to the juicy bit, to Jesus' death and resurrection. That's the main focus. You can feel it in the speed of the text. It's so quick, and then it goes hour by hour when it gets to his death and persecution. And then we have the cynic who says, well, surely this is all just less trustworthy because they're all just lying and they're all just trying to tell us what they think the truth is, and they're trying to cheat us out of our belief system. But then we have John, and I love John because he comes in and he says, okay, well, you can say that Matthew and Luke and Mark were all using the same source, so it's not that trustworthy. But he says, I'm using my own sources, I'm different to them, I'm telling the same stories, I'm writing about the same man, I'm writing about the same miracles that he did, but there's no overlap between us. And we see that actually what was going on is that the writers of each 4 Gospels had their own agendas. They had their own ideas of what they wanted to push from Jesus' ministry. All 4 of them say that being a disciple of Jesus is important. Let's start with Mark. Mark's straight to the point. He's like, the kingdom of God, it's important. We need to know about it. And it's all about Jesus' suffering and death. Then we have Matthew, who's much more fleshed out in his discipleship themes. And he's all about being a disciple is way more important. And it's not just about being a disciple when Jesus dies. It's about being a disciple in Jesus' ministry. And he fleshes out the stories and he adds more detail. And then we have Luke, who's way more focused on the poor and way more focused about helping those in need. Not that Mark and Matthew don't focus on that, but for Luke, it's really, really vital. And he's recording from his point of view, that was Jesus' ministry. It's all about the poor and discipleship and other themes. And then we have John, who takes his own agenda and he says Jesus is the Son of God. And I'm going to show you, in fact, if you just read the first 2 chapters, I think Jesus gets called the Messiah like 3 or 4 times before he does anything. John is just reaffirming that Jesus is the Messiah, and there is no mistake about it. All of them have their own perspective of Jesus' life, and all of them have their own takeaways of Jesus' life, and that's what it's about. That's why there's 4 Gospels. It doesn't make it less trustworthy, it makes it more trustworthy. And then you can be a total cynic and you can just be like, no, I'm going to deny everything. But the coincidence of Matthew, Mark and Luke and John writing about this random bloke called Jesus who died on a cross, it's bizarre. It's just strange. I hope you guys have enjoyed this summary of the Markan priority. I'll see you later.